So thank you all for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Jacob Silverman. I am Amrit Deer. I work in new business development here in Mountain View. Jacob Silverman's recently released book, Terms of Service, is a call for social media users to take back ownership of their digital lives. Integrating politics, sociology, pop culture, and technology, Silverman explores the surprising conformity at the heart of the digital culture and what it means now that none of us can ever be alone. Reflecting on the implications of the collapsed barriers between our private and public lives, Terms of Service explains how social media companies engineer their products to encourage shallow engagement and discourage dissent. Illuminating the new era of connectivity as never before, Silverman brings into focus the inner conflict we feel when deciding what to share and what to, quote, like, and explains how we can take steps we need to free ourselves. Silverman's work has been published in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and many other publications. In 2008, the Virginia Quarterly Review recognized him as one of the top literary critics under 30. And in 2012, this is the coolest part, he was a 3-time Jeopardy champion. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and I also want to say a couple words because I've known Jacob for 18 plus years. He and I went to high school and college together. And so I thought, given that some of his work is obviously critical of social media companies, of which we are included, I was really glad to bring him here to Google because I know this is a community that encourages discourse and is welcoming of challenging ideas. And also because I thought it would be really fun / ironic / potentially inappropriate for me to go through my old emails and find something about Jacob and then and then publicly display it, not only here in this room, but also for the YouTube audience, possibly in favor of those who he critiques. And so I went through my emails, and the interesting thing is, so Jacob and I have been friends for many years, and he was with me an early Facebook user. What's interesting is that Facebook actually did a really good job of having everything that he ever posted on my wall removed. So there was lots of gems in there, but I couldn't get them. So
I
Facebook
deleted my account, you mean?
Yeah, because you deleted your account. Yeah. But what I did find, and I put this at the end of your slide deck, little did you know, by sending this slide deck to me, you actually, Google owns it all. But this was the first thing I found, which is Jacob forwarding me a feature in CNN.com about what it's like to work at Google. And he said, and I quote, "Looks amazing."
I was naive then.
In a naive, aspirational Googler. And then the second one was actually pretty interesting. So this is when I searched Google Jacob, and then when I searched Facebook Jacob, I got this, which was amazingly consistent with Jacob's current views. Okay, so without talking much more, I'll introduce Jacob Silverman.
That was great. I thought it was going to be more embarrassing. Hello, thanks for having me. So this is the kind of very lofty and pretentious title of my talk, but it gives you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to also be talking about issues that are kind of related to my book and related to what Amrit was talking about, but some of this stuff is sort of new, or at least new for me to be talking about, and kind of a jumping off point of where my book has brought me and some of the issues that concern me now. So I'd like to start with this one, this image macro. Perhaps you've seen something like this floating around on social media over the last year. I think it's a pretty clever setup. Look at all those people immersed in their newspapers and not talking to each other. With that one line, all this technology is making us antisocial, an argument is made. It is also, I think, totally wrong and misleading. But it's a useful departure point for considering how we talk about technology and our relationship to it. And I think the sheer popularity of kind of images and arguments like this tells us a lot about how we think about technology and how we sort of relate to it. But first, let's figure out what's really going on in this scene. We should start by narrowing down what's actually meant by technology, a broad term that we often use as a helpful shorthand, but that can lead us down some rabbit holes. Here, technology simply refers to these newspapers that everyone is reading. And newspapers are a technology, or at least the convergence of many technologies surrounding printing, production, delivery, and so on. Newspapers are such a good technology that they've stuck around, embattled, sure, but not much different than they were 100 or 200 years ago. The machines and processes we use to make them have vastly improved. The journalistic culture has changed, but newspapers themselves are rather similar. Newsprint, ink, some text, graphics. And newspapers are tremendously useful things. They offer the day's news. You can fold them up and put them in your bag. You can swat a fly with them or use them as wrapping paper. You can take it in the bath or give the paper to a friend. You can write notes on it and tear out a page and share it with your kids. You can stuff the newspaper in a closet and 20 years later take it out and it'll probably still be readable. That's probably not going to be the case with your smartphone or laptop. But what else is going on here? If I were a more thorough researcher, I'd have tried to find out the provenance of this photo, but I think it's also more fun to speculate. To me, it looks like a passenger commuter train, perhaps in the 1940s. It appears to be an English-speaking country, probably the United States or perhaps England. The posters at the front of the car seem to say free, and another has a photo of what looks like a soldier. That might be a draft poster or something encouraging people to buy war bonds, though because there are so many men on this train, I wonder if it's still wartime. We should also note that there aren't many women here, nor a single person of color. This is mostly a space for white men, perhaps going to work at the beginning of the day. So are these newspapers making them antisocial, as that little comment at the top would have it? Not really, not in the sense that newspapers have their own volition and can force someone to do something. In fact, they're probably all reading the same newspaper or from one of the same one or two papers. Print media is pretty vibrant in these times with lots of competition. That means that they're mostly reading about the same events, perhaps even the same articles, and in fact have much in common. What else? There are limits to how much close reading we can do, and we should keep in mind that every photograph is in some sense constructed, and some are more constructed than others. There's a degree of staging here, something the photographer was deliberately trying to capture, a scene of men together, alone, but also together, as Sherry Turkle describes it, immersed in their daily papers and rituals. So how would this scene look today? Maybe something like this. That image macro implied that there was a lineage between old technologies and new, occupying similar places in the social fabric. Today, this photo might be on a subway or a plane, this is from Hong Kong, I believe, with a smartphone in every person's hand. It'd be a more diverse crowd, but the train would probably be crummier. This is hardly an era in which we invest in public infrastructure. Soon we'll all be reading contentedly in our own private self-driven cars. And while today it looked like everyone is doing the same thing, staring numbly into the intoxicating glow of a smartphone screen, they could be doing any number of things with these multifunction devices. Few of them, I'm afraid, would be reading newspapers on their phones, but who knows? Maybe these imaginary people will be reading news and catching up on the events of the world and not just scrolling through social media feeds, watching viral videos, playing freemium games, and listening to low bitrate streaming music. It's hard to say. Each person in this kind of scene would be wrapped up in his or her own highly personalized, filtered world, even as they all seem to be absorbed with the same technology, a smartphone, today's universal prosthetic. If we go back for a second to the original photo, one other thing we can say about newspapers is that they don't change. They do decay, but otherwise they're static. They won't update with the next day's news. They won't push notifications if something important develops. They won't interrupt the act of reading with an alert of a new message from a friend. And they also, and this is pretty important, I think, won't collect any information on their readers. They have ads, but these ads don't know anything about us. Newspapers are dumb analog objects. Not a perfect technology, of course, but I think with much to admire. Those smartphones, on the other hand, those insulating technologies that are supposedly keeping us from knowing one another, are always on, always active. Increasingly, they're watching us, monitoring us, trying to decode what we like, who we are, how we behave. They're always snitching on us, ostensibly for our benefit, but really betraying our confidence and, yes, our privacy to whoever has access to the data we produce. After all, surveillance is the business model of the internet. Data is the great resource and commodity of today. though in this case by data we really mean personal information, habits, preferences, and the like, or our likes, your personal information and mine. And the more intimate and revealing, the better, particularly if this information can be gathered over a long period, giving whoever is collecting it a picture of your habits and tendencies. This pretty excessively long preamble is my way of introducing a few themes for today, namely surveillance, data, privacy, power, and how they affect our lives. But I also started by focusing on this photograph here because I think how we talk about technology can be just as important as what we say about it. I have sort of one foot in the academic world, and people in academia are always talking about discourse. This photograph reflects, I think, a certain argument, a certain worldview. In analyzing it, we come to understand that technology is not just something that lives on its own, that's somehow ethically neutral or an abstraction. That technology is an embodiment of the social, political, and economic conditions in which it's made and in which it's used. It often incorporates human intention and human error. This is a kind of crummy photo that someone posted on Twitter, but it's a photo from a middle school hallway. This is a poster, and that's supposed to be like a CCTV camera. Surveillance and data collection have become central to our lives and to the flow of information and money today. But surveillance isn't benign. As the law scholar Frank Pasquale says, surveillance is not just a camera, but an engine driving society in a certain direction. He's right, and it's worth thinking about what that direction is. Surveillance is generally coercive, instrumentalist, designed to discover something or to preserve a state of affairs. When we're aware of surveillance, especially when we come to understand that the things we do and say are being fed into systems that potentially shape our future experiences, where we go, what we see, what opportunities we have, whether law enforcement decides we're a threat, it alters the relationship. It potentially introduces a kind of dissonance, a feeling of self-consciousness. Perhaps if you're a student who sees this poster walking down the hall, I'm sure it might put you a little ill at ease. But it's a self-consciousness that's difficult to contend with because so often there's nothing we can do. Think about how you might feel when a cop pulls up alongside your car or you notice a bank of CCTV cameras in a store. Suddenly your attitude, your manner of being in the world shifts. You're on notice. We live in a culture of surveillance, but what does that mean exactly? It's not just about these processes of monitoring, collecting, sorting, and data mining. Surveillance is something that's done to us, and it's something we do. So we watch reality TV, we set up cameras in our homes to monitor children, pets, or babysitters. We broadcast our lives on social media. We take videos of cops because we're worried about how they may treat someone they're arresting. We establish online profiles and update them so that we might never feel invisible. We watch and are watched all the time. This is how we often think of surveillance these days. This is a panopticon, in this case part of an old prison in Illinois. Michel Foucault said that the panopticon wasn't just, quote, a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. The 19th century political philosopher Jeremy Bentham designed the panopticon as a kind of ideal prison. Guards stand in the tower in the middle. A ring of cells surrounds the tower. Prisoners can see the tower and have the feeling of being watched, which is supposed to check their behavior. But in an ideal panopticon, they can't tell where a guard might be looking. The prisoners are totally transparent to the guards, while the guards are opaque, shadowed, hidden. Sounds to me a little like the relationship between citizens and government today, or between consumers and tech companies. But the panopticon metaphor is a bit worn out, simplistic. It's used all the time now, and it's perhaps time to move beyond it. I think it doesn't quite capture the fullness of what's going on, nor how highly distributed and variable surveillance has become. Rather than living under the unforgiving gaze of a panoptic or Orwellian society, it's more accurate to say that we live in a state of constant possible surveillance. This is why Kafka, not Orwell, is the great writer for today, though Orwell has plenty to recommend him. In Kafka's work, power is obscured, hidden. We're aware of its presence and its effect on characters, but often only too late. In Kafka's work, power presents itself suddenly, brutally, and mysteriously, sometimes using surveillance in the process. This kind of disembodied, floating power, always lurking just out of view, is a helpful framework for studying today's surveillance culture. I just love that photo. Kafka was, for much of his adult life, a lawyer with an insurance company. He essentially was a bureaucrat and had a sense of how power could be wielded by opaque institutions. Today, we deal with all kinds of bureaucracy, often to our own frustration and often of a familiar sort. But I think software represents a new kind of bureaucracy. Algorithms act as the bureaucrats, making decisions based on inscrutable or secret criteria. And we, the users, act as data producers and nodes and feedback loops that increasingly shape our surrounding world. Consider this passage from an article describing a maker of smartphone games, and I got a long quote here. GSN does not simply track customers' preferences and customize its services accordingly, as many digital businesses do. In an effort to induce players to play longer and try more games, it uses the data it pulls from phones to watch for signs that they are tiring. Largely by measuring how frequently, how fervently, and how quickly you press on the screen, the company can predict with a high degree of accuracy just when you're likely to lose interest, giving it the chance to suggest other games long before that happens. The games are free, but GSN shows ads and sells virtual items that are useful to players, so the company can persuade someone to play. So the longer the company can persuade someone to play, the more money it can make, end quote. So essentially what we have here is this company GSN, which makes a little gambling and poker apps and things like that, is tracking what people do, how they respond, and sort of trying various prods and nudges and perhaps even changing the parameters of a game to try to get someone to play longer. That's from an article about what are called persuasive technologies, technologies that try to get us to do something, perhaps with our own consent, perhaps arguably for our own benefit, like a fitness monitor that prods its owner to sleep more. But of course, these persuasive techniques first and foremost help the bottom lines of the companies behind them. And even that fitness monitor, to take one example, might be trying to get me to sleep more because it's cut a deal with my health insurer and my employer that in exchange for us wearing fitness monitors, we'll achieve certain health benchmarks, fork over more personal information, and save the company some money on health costs. These so-called persuasive technologies offer more visible manifestations of how power operates in networked digital systems. And even these are only visible because they're reported on, and in some cases, companies are so proud of their innovations, of their ability to persuade, that they're willing to disclose how they work. But most people playing GSN's games likely have no idea that they are essentially being coaxed and herded toward desirable behaviors, all with the goal of keeping them on the platform. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold. The type of power we're talking about here is invisible and mysterious, and that's what I think makes it so confounding. That's what makes it difficult to talk about, to regulate, to protest, to argue over, to defend, to legislate, and on and on. We have to make it visible first. We have to learn how to describe it and articulate its contours. There are many other possible examples of these sort of persuasive technologies or of this kind of hidden movement of power that I'm talking about. Some of them may be familiar to you. Ads that show up in pivotal moments in games, call center software that gauges customers' emotional states and sorts out the possible troublemakers, online retailers that employ differential pricing software that offers a different price for each customer based on personal data and the software's judgment of what they might pay. I have to apologize for the next slide. Or you might recall that Facebook got in trouble last summer for releasing the results of a study in which it manipulated the content of more than 600,000 users' news feeds to show happier or sadder content. The company wanted to know if it can induce certain emotional states in users and then see those emotions travel through the network. And for people like me who study the tech industry with a kind of disturbed admiration at its influence over customers, it was an unnerving experiment. Not only because Facebook seemed to think that it had done nothing wrong, but because these kinds of experiments go on all the time in secret. And of course, Facebook never asked the users who were involved in the study for consent. It presumed, based on their accepting the terms of service agreement, that they had already given it. Indeed, the fact that these experiments go on all the time, that's what OkCupid founder Christian Reuter told us. Quote, "We experiment on human beings," he wrote on OkCupid's blog. Continuing the quote, "If you use the internet, you're the subject of hundreds of experiments at any given time on every site. That's how websites work." It was troubling to see Reuter being so enthusiastic about this state of affairs, but he's correct at least in one sense. Many tech companies are in the behavior modification business. That this represents the status quo doesn't make it ethical. It also doesn't mean that it can't change for the better. Frank Pasquale, who I quoted earlier, calls this world the black box society, a place where surveillance, data collection, sorting algorithms, and related systems exert a peculiar kind of control. This kind of control may be based on millions of A/B tests, reflecting the kind of experimentation that so excites Christian Reuter, or it may be utter pseudoscience, but with a patina of mathematical precision, of the unimpeachable authority of a computer. The TSA, for instance, has spent more than $900 million tracking the behavior of human beings in airports across the country. The idea is that would-be terrorists might be spotted by noticing certain telltale tics, as if finding a terrorist in a crowd is like spotting a poker player's bluff. A number of studies have found that these techniques are utterly useless, supposedly revealing signs like someone who's visibly nervous or sweating or asking a few too many questions are common to many travelers, but that hasn't stopped the TSA from pouring resources into this and other similarly crummy programs, most of them based on saturating our airports and various transport networks with CCTV and surveillance and facial recognition and all sorts of forms of data collection and data mining. But after all, this is why it's called security theater. The authorities must be seen doing something, even if it's an utter waste. And who knows, perhaps advances in facial recognition and other forms of biometric monitoring will soon render all of this moot. Would-be terrorists will be spotted because an algorithm decides that their style of walking looks suspicious, or that they spent a few seconds more than the average traveler lingering around the security area. It's through this kind of logic, which I think in some ways represents the logic of big data, that some behaviors become normalized and others criminalized. Like the internet, airports increasingly represent personalized filter bubbles, where different demographics and even individuals are assessed and sorted according to obscure criteria that's never shared with them. This is how we get black and brown people randomly selected for additional inspection, interrogation, and suspicion, while whites and other privileged populations are allowed to smoothly pass through pre-check. In other words, the black box society affects different populations in different ways. Here's one stark example. I hope you'll pardon my crude graphic skills here, but at the top, here we have two opposite approaches to network cars. At the top, you have a tweet from Elon Musk describing how owners of a certain Tesla car are going to receive an over-the-air software update to an inverter algorithm, and it's going to make the acceleration 0.1 second faster. On the bottom here, this is taken from an article about these interrupter devices that are put on cars for people who get high-interest loans in order to afford cars. And I see here two opposite approaches to network cars. Those who can afford expensive Teslas receive over-the-air software updates that improve the car's performance. It seems like a great deal, this promise of incremental periodic updates for your car, though maybe we should be wary of cars that increasingly act like computers, that basically are computers with engines attached. Soon enough, they'll be accumulating viruses or refusing to drive because we haven't installed the latest firmware update. But for now, I guess, this must seem kind of cool. In the second example, subprime lenders cajole buyers into accepting devices called startup interrupters, which can be activated remotely to shut down the car if the borrower is even a day late on a payment. Many people who take this kind of deal have little choice. They need a car to get to their job or to take their kids to school. They're often from low-income backgrounds, so they accept the 29% interest rate and the mysterious interrupter device that's planted in their car. Some of these interrupters are also geofenced, meaning that the car might be shut down if the driver goes out of a designated area. The lenders and repo men operating the interrupter software have a real-time view of everywhere a driver goes. They know when she goes to work, or in the case of one Texas driver who had her car shut off, when she leaves her geofenced area to go to a shelter to find refuge from an abusive husband. In this woman's case, the lender shut down her car and sent a tow truck to repossess it while she was still at the shelter. Others have had their cars shut off before their loans actually go into default, during family emergencies, or even while driving on the freeway. What unites these examples, in fact, what I think is a defining feature of the black box society and of a world in which software acts as a new form of bureaucracy, is the difficulty of appeal. Who can you ask for help for some understanding or accommodation or relief from standard operating procedures. Even when it's possible to talk to a real human being, that person can always point to the terms of service agreement or the mechanics of the software to remind the customer, this is just how it is, you're stuck. These kinds of arrangements are endemic to what's been called the sharing economy. On GigWalk, a jobs marketplace like Mechanical Turk that assigns tasks through smartphones, workers who don't respond to tasks within 30 minutes are penalized. This fact isn't advertised, which makes it even more difficult for workers who may not realize why they're not getting the kinds of tasks they were being offered before. Not long ago, I took a car through Halo, a taxi through Halo, to take my cat to the vet. It seemed like a pleasant enough cab ride. I tried to apologize for my cat's meowing, and the driver didn't seem bothered. But then as I stepped out of the car, I noticed him give me a rating of 3 stars. Since then, when I open the Halo app, I'm told that there aren't any cars available. Is it true? Are there no drivers in my area anymore? Or was I downgraded in the app by that rating and now drivers are refusing to pick me up? It's hard to know, and I probably never will, so goodbye to Halo for me. Obviously, my situation pales against that of a GigWalk worker or sharing economy laborer who face these kinds of dilemmas constantly. Uber drivers are let go after their ratings fall under 4.6 stars. They're not fired exactly. After all, they're not employees in any legal sense, which has been key to Uber's growth. The app simply deactivates their accounts, meaning that they can no longer earn money driving for Uber. What can a driver do but accept this arrangement, or go work for a competitor who probably has similarly abusive policies? In the end, power lies with whomever is controlling the app. One of the problems I mentioned earlier is that when we're dealing with computers and other machines, we often assume that they can do no wrong, that whatever information or result they produce is the correct one. A calculator never lies. But it doesn't take much digging to understand that automated systems reflect the biases and tensions and social conditions of their creators. LaTanya Sweeney, a computer scientist and Harvard professor, discovered this when she ran a Google search on herself several years ago. The ads that appeared next to her name were mostly offers for criminal background checks and to look up her criminal record. Sweeney had no criminal record, so she decided to do some digging. In fact, she conducted a study with some funding from Google and found that traditionally black names like hers were 25% more likely to yield ads for criminal records than were white names. Now, there are many possible explanations for what was going on there. It could be the fault of a programmer at Instant Checkmate, which bought the ad. It could be that racist users of Google Search more often click on arrest records of people with black-sounding names. There are many possible explanations. It might not even be possible to isolate a single factor. Ad systems are pretty complex, as you all know better than I do. But the difficulty of knowing exactly what happened is a major part of the problem. In the meantime, we can see these kinds of biases and blind spots cropping up all over. A study by scholars at Carnegie Mellon found that women searching job sites are shown fewer opportunities for higher-paying jobs than men are. In England recently, a female pediatrician was trying to get into the locker room at her gym, and she found that the keypad on the door wouldn't recognize her PIN. She later learned that the keypad software was programmed to only recognize men as doctors, and this woman had checked a box on the gym's sign-up form to indicate that she was a doctor. In one sense, the software was acting correctly, trying to bar a man, or what it thought was a man, from accessing the women's locker room. But obviously, because it was programmed to only recognize doctors as men, it had been programmed in a sexist manner. Earlier, I mentioned data as a new commodity. It's what allows our semi-automated surveillance society to function. In practice, data acts something like a fluid, I think, ending up in often unexpected places. In 2013, LaTanya Sweeney, the same Harvard professor I just mentioned, devised this map showing where health data travels. As you can see, it's a vast but loose network, and many of the holders of this data arguably have no right or reasonable use for it. One of the points that Sweeney has made is that maps like this are incomplete, offering only a partial sense of where, in this case, medical data might end up. But I think that she also would propose that this process of mapping, of discovery, of trying to make these networks visible is just as important. This idea of circulation of data as something that flows through systems and networks is key. Where data flows, power does as well. But this idea isn't entirely new. If data is a commodity, then think of it as just another form of money. And these days, money is just another form of information. It all flows through the same pipes. The flow of money and information has long been central to the functioning of capitalism, but the journey hasn't always been so smooth as it is today. Here's Karl Marx writing in 1858, quote, "Capital by its very nature drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus the creation of the physical conditions of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it." This, I think, is the great achievement of the internet, altering the physical conditions of exchange. As Marx might have described it, the internet annihilated space and time as impediments to the flow of capital and information. Or at least the internet has nearly achieved that. High-frequency traders, for instance, are always trying to shave another pico or nanosecond off their trades, whether by moving their servers closer to Wall Street or hooking up to a fiber optic cable that offers their information an ever so slightly straighter, quicker path to its destination. This is a map of world telegraph lines in 1875, around the time that Marx was writing. And the reason, I think, why Marx was able to make this kind of insight was not just because he was smart, but because he also lived in the early days of electrical networks. By 1858, when that quote is from, telegraph lines were transporting news and information around the world with a previously unheard of speed. They were collapsing the barriers of space and moving us closer to a world in which the speed of light would be the only limit on the flow of capital. Before the telegraph, the movement of information was limited by the speed of a steamship, a horse, a sailboat, or a person's feet. Though, as James Gleick has shown, some savvy people found ways around these physical barriers. In West Africa, indigenous communities long used drums to communicate over long distances, to transform information into something intangible that could be transmitted through the air, through sound itself. It's really a kind of remarkable innovation. There, the speed of sound and the density of air limited how far information could travel, but there were ways around that too. Say, by having an adjacent community act as a kind of relay, taking in the message and re-articulating it, retransmitting it to the next tribe over. The same thing was done in other times in other parts of the world with smoke signals or by lighting beacon fires to announce the arrival of an invading army. One of the great innovations of the internet was to take information, chop it up into packets, send them out, and reassemble them at their destination. But in these pre-industrial communities, you can see similar techniques at work, filtered through the technologies of the time. Let's get back to Marx and this idea of circulation. As capital flowed through networks, Marx saw it transforming, sometimes representing money, sometimes a commodity, sometimes something else entirely. As the writer Jonathan Crary noted, quote, "This was hardly a one-time transmutation, for with each successive upgrading and expansion of these networks, new forms of fluidity and convertibility emerged," end quote. This is one of the achievements of the Industrial Revolution in the decades that followed. The telegraph network was joined by wireless telegraphy, the telephone by radio, microwave, satellites. Before the rise of AT&T, some small towns had their own telephone networks, which connected a few homes or an entire community but went no farther. Some banking networks still run on old mainframes and use COBOL, a programming language that's nearly 60 years old. These networks continue to operate in parallel to our own internet. In fact, I'd argue that if we step back and look at all these various networks, all these ways of transmitting information as a flow, that we've been blinded by the internet. We've become enchanted by this idea of one monolithic global network through which all information must travel. Following the Snowden revelations, some countries have started requiring companies to store customer data within their borders, or have begun investing in what might be described as countrywide intranets. Increasingly, commentators worry about the so-called balkanization of the internet. It's being broken up as new barriers are introduced to the once smooth flow of capital and information across borders. But if we think of the internet as simply the latest and not the only network transporting information, we might not fear this as much. We might even say that this internet, our internet, isn't as great as it could be, and that might even be worth replacing. We might also begin to question whether the unimpeded flow of data is all that it's cracked up to be. Perhaps there are some places we don't want our data to go. Perhaps there are some types of data that should be difficult to find, that should become obscure or disappear, forgotten. I'm not the first to come to this kind of conclusion. Yevgeny Morozov argues that there's actually no such thing as the internet, which he likes to put in scare quotes. And I've become increasingly sympathetic to this kind of view. Not only are there many information networks, some of which are linked together in what we call the internet, but each of us increasingly has a singular experience in relation to these networks. Our own experience is composed of our filter bubbles and personalized services, our specific journeys through difficult and sometimes overlapping bureaucracies. The internet, too, is simply a shared set of protocols, and one might argue that the World Wide Web, the hypertext transfer protocol, should be considered its own network, apart from this thing we call the internet. By taking this view, by unbundling these various networks, I hope we can look at them anew and learn something about the relationship between the flow of data and the flow of power. These days, it's fashionable to look at our global communications networks and think we've achieved something momentous, that perhaps, in the parlance of Silicon Valley, the world is being made a better place. But this is a dream that has followed every advance in communications since time immemorial. Guglielmo Marconi, a pioneer of radio, one of those pivotal networks of yesteryear, said that, quote, "The coming of the wireless era will make war impossible because it will make war ridiculous." When I hear Mark Zuckerberg say that Facebook is a tool for advancing world peace or that internet connectivity is a human right, I hear the hopelessly naive bombast of Marconi. This is a map of global shipping lanes, which I think also has the appearance of a kind of network. What the internet has achieved then is to enfold people more closely together in networks of communication, capital, and exchange, and more recently in systems of monitoring and surveillance. This is no small thing, but I don't think it's a revolution. It's merely an incremental, if important, step beyond the kinds of communication networks that inspired Marx. What I think we need then is to understand what this world of data-driven surveillance and automation that I spoke of earlier truly represents. Where others speak of convenience, I see the surrender of control. Where others speak of personal liberation, I see the same faded dreams of emancipation that have dogged every industrial epoch. Where others find a new kind of sociality, I worry that we are giving up some essential form of autonomy. But the advantage of this point of view, I would argue, is that it doesn't treat the internet and our new digital technologies as magical. It grants them no credit simply because they seem special or novel. Instead, it proposes that in our relentlessly digitized world, people are struggling with the same challenges of discrimination, politics, economics, labor, and the right to live life as one chooses. None of that will go away because of the advent of a new device or a new way of communicating. The world is still hopelessly mediated, despite all the talk these days about disintermediation. With new platforms and corporate powers replacing the old, there are simply new middlemen that we may not recognize as middlemen. The great hope of some true believers is that the screens in our hands, our cars, our offices, and practically everywhere else will be replaced by something even more seamless, as the digital becomes not an overlay, not some isolated network, but perfectly entwined with the physical world. Call it pervasive computing, ubiquitous computing, augmented reality, ambient computation, whatever you like. We'll be able to call upon networked interfaces wherever we desire. They may even be implanted in us, or perhaps we'll simply be content to wear them on our wrists, which have become the latest site of digital mediation. Jonathan Crary, commenting on such a utopian prophecy, had this to say, quote, "If and when such devices are introduced and labeled as revolutionary, they will simply be facilitating the perpetuation of the same banal exercise of nonstop consumption, social isolation, and political powerlessness, rather than representing some historically significant turning point." End quote. In other words, they too will be replaced. Today's remarkable gadget is tomorrow's e-waste. The human drama remains largely the same, though we may be more distracted from the main event. It's a dark point of view, but I find a weird kind of optimism in it. The sort of optimism that puts people before their devices. If we accept that all these products and systems are disposable, fade to become so much techno-trash, what does that mean? Perhaps it tells us that people are capable of more than we think, that data shouldn't be mistaken for knowledge, and that our digital shadows reflect us but aren't us, and so we shouldn't let them define our experience in the world. Finally, it may give us pause on this, our long march toward a society in which no one is left alone or unmonitored. There we can catch our breath and say, our technologies aren't driving us apart, but they aren't quite serving us either. And maybe out there lies some better way of being, hidden behind the algorithmic curtain. Thanks.
Okay, so we have some time for Q&A.
I was curious what you would recommend we do to be safer, more secure, or just smarter about our own digital lives.
I mean, well, frankly, being here at Google, I fear you guys could tell me more than I could tell you. People ask me this stuff a lot, and I find it challenging because there's certainly stuff you can do. You can, one of the things I write about a lot is kind of sort of the ad-driven surveillance economy, which bothers me a lot, though, which is we have to acknowledge the main source of revenue here. So I do things like I use ad blockers or often use a VPN, occasionally a Tor browser, things like that. And I think there are these kind of technological tools to mask your identity if you want, or kind of cover up the amount of data you might be leaking towards whoever might be watching. On the other hand, I'd really rather see that we find new business models and new kinds of systems are created that aren't so dependent on kind of monetizing the raw material of people's daily lives and who they are. And one reason why I certainly don't mind recommending specific solutions to individuals, but why I also talk a lot about regulation and kind of government intervention of some sort is because I think that we have these ethical impulses, right, that we want these services to be as useful and kind of amazing as they can be, but we also want people to feel safe and protected while using them. And I think the virtue of regulation is that it sort of takes that ethical impulse and establishes it as policy that can help everyone. And a lot of people really don't have the time, resources, or education to deal with this kind of stuff, or to even really worry about, is information about me being put into some credit report that's going to be used against me in a future job interview. Most people will never know that even happens.
Do you feel that the surveillance that's done without people knowing is in itself unethical, and how that compares to the fact that that's being done for profit? And so just to put it another way, if you can imagine someone in a position of power using information about people's habits and knowledge about psychology to inject certain articles into people's streams,
right,
that could potentially reduce racial tensions between two different groups or have some benefit to society where they're not trying to profit from it, but it's being done using these same kinds of techniques, that they're being done in secret. They're not transparent about it, but they're being done for a different reason. Would you find that is unethical?
I don't know. I think that is one of those sort of hinge cases that would leave me open to saying perhaps that's totally fine. I mean, what people like me in the world of sort of journalism worry about with an example kind of related to that is Facebook has so much power as pretty much the homepage of the internet for a lot of people, as by far the biggest driver of readers to news articles. And for a long time, people have worried that Facebook really privileges bad content, and then they kind of got rid of a lot of the clickbait stuff. But then it seemed, and they just released a study about it, that political content, especially about current events, things like the riots in Baltimore, were not showing up enough on people's news feeds, and perhaps were being suppressed by the news feed algorithm. But the problem is, it's like, what do we want from something like Facebook? If Facebook were some nonprofit company that had a more public-spirited mission that says we want people to be informed, so we're going to filter all this information on their behalf and kind of decide what they should be reading and what might be important to them, that's a little different than the current Facebook we have, which is this giant for-profit monolith who, of course, mostly cares about people staying on the platform. To kind of go to your broader question of, can data collection surveillance be used for the public good? I think in some ways it can. I think sometimes, though, it's in very basic methods like, and this isn't even a nonprofit purpose, but you have companies that track how many people go through intersections and things like that. And that seems like something really basic, but that's actually really important for urban planning or for someone who wants to start a restaurant somewhere or something like that. And you're not storing data on who people are unless you link that up to some facial recognition program. But you are kind of using similar techniques and processes for something that can potentially help people, but also won't create this permanent data trail or associate them with something that they don't want to be associated with.
As someone who's trying to design experiences for people, which may hinge on this content. So your example of Uber, a different service where you didn't see any more cars and it was not transparent to you what was being shown. Do you think that your experience would you be okay with that kind of decision on the part of the designer if it was at least transparent what was going on?
I think it's a good question. I think I would appreciate it more, certainly, if I knew, look, you're not getting cars because your rating is kind of low or something like that. If there were some sort of transparency, yeah, I think I'd probably appreciate that. Though I do think in the case of a lot of these apps and the way the sort of sharing economy works is that you are required to make these very brief assessments of people or ratings that can often prove very consequential. So I kind of think that that whole rating system is flawed from the outset. On the other hand, though, I think this idea of transparency is good. A lot of people talk about this, especially in the academic world. They talk about transparency or making these systems legible. I use the term visibility a lot, but they have to be legible somehow in order for us to know, what kind of power they are exerting over us. And the problem, I think, and the problem I have even when giving this kind of talk is that a lot of this stuff is still very new, or these types of power, it can be very hazy. And the difference between something that's someone exerting some sort of control or influence on you or someone really helping you, it can be a fine line. You don't always really know, right? We're kind of in this murky territory where am I giving up some essential kind of personal autonomy by kind of giving myself over to these systems? At times it does feel like it, but perhaps in other situations it doesn't. And I think something that can make people more comfortable with not only like giving over personal information, but with delegating that kind of power or autonomy is if they really know how the processes work. Of course, there are always concerns about trade secrets and things like that, but I think there's definitely room to kind of be more transparent and to tell users more about how these systems work.